The Red Alert universe isn't just another alternate history. It's a kaleidoscope of chaos where logic takes a backseat to mayhem and madness. It starts with Einstein traveling back in time to stop the Second World War. But instead of peace, his actions unleash something far stranger: psychic warfare, time travel paradoxes, and a fractured multiverse of divergent timelines. In one future, the Soviet Union conquers all of Europe. In another, America falls under psychic domination. And in yet another, anime war mechs from the Empire of the Rising Sun descend from the sky to rewrite history again. Mind control, teleportation, weather weapons, and dinosaur-filled time loops. This is not your average Cold War. But how does it all fit together? This is the complete timeline of Command and Conquer, Red Alert. Every canon ending, every alternate future, and every insane twist that makes this one of the most bizarre and beloved strategy franchises ever made. In 1946, humanity emerged from one of the most horrific wars in its history. World War II had ended, but at an immense cost. Tens of millions were dead, claimed by genocide, starvation, massacres, and disease. As the world struggled to rebuild in the aftermath of fascism's defeat, one man resolved to ensure such a catastrophe would never happen again. Albert Einstein, the brilliant physicist, had developed a time machine at a research facility in Trinity, New Mexico. Believing that the rise of fascism was the root of the war, he set out to alter history. Traveling back to 1924, he arrived outside Landsberg prison in Germany, just as the little man with a mustache was being released after his failed coup. Einstein approached him and with a single handshake erased him from the timeline. He returned to the present, greeted by his assistant's questions, but could offer no certainty about what new future he had created. While Einstein's actions had prevented World War II as it was known, they disrupted the fragile balance of global power. In the new timeline, without Germany to oppose it, the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin expanded unchecked. Guided by dreams of an unknown origin, Stalin envisioned a worldwide Soviet empire, with himself as the unquestioned ruler over both the minds and spirits of his people, making a new global conflict inevitable. The Soviet Union commanded a massive force, 14 million enlisted troops and over 7 million personnel in other state services. Economically, it wielded vast assets and operated an extensive spy network of over 200 million agents, with influence across Pan-African, Pan-Indian, and Pan-Asian governments. In contrast, the Allied forces were significantly smaller, comprising just 3.4 million enlisted troops and approximately 1.7 million irregular resistance fighters. At some point before the Second World War, Joseph Stalin fell under the subtle influence of a mysterious figure known only as Cain. As explored in the Tiberium Universe video, Cain is no ordinary man. He is an ageless manipulator, present since the dawn of civilization, whispering in the ears of pharaohs, emperors, and generals. Though he rarely appears directly in the Red Alert timeline, his shadow is unmistakable. It was around this same time that Stalin began to work with another enigmatic figure, Yuri. Yuri's origins are deliberately obscured. What is known is that he was of Romanian descent, inheritor of a castle in Transylvania, a suitably eerie seat for a man cloaked in psychic mystery. Some believe the symbol etched into Yuri's forehead bears resemblance to ancient Hebrew script, a possible sign of his link to the Brotherhood of Nod. Whispers persist that he may not have been born in this time at all, that Cain sent him from the future, implanting him in the heart of Soviet power to advance Nod's shadowy designs. Regardless of the truth, Yuri served as one of Stalin's top advisors during the war. But his loyalty was never truly to Stalin, and as later events would show, Yuri had ambitions of his own. Spurred on by his shadowy advisors, the Soviet Union began its war against the Allied forces in the West. In the version of history that is not canon, it was not the Allies who triumphed, but the Soviet Union. The campaign began with an audacious assault across the German frontier. Despite sabotage to the river bridges, Soviet infantry divisions crossed under fire, tearing into enemy territory. From the snowy passes of Finland to the urban centers of Germany, the Red Tide swept forward, led by ruthless commanders like Radik Gradenko and Georgy Kukov. In Sweden, an Allied spy attempted to cripple the Soviet war effort by destroying a key gas facility. Though aided by local resistance, the infiltrator was ultimately captured and executed. Meanwhile, Soviet agents uncovered vulnerabilities in the German command structure. A strike on communication centers near Berlin split Allied defenses, allowing the Red Army to seize the capital with surgical precision. As the campaign expanded into Eastern Europe, Stalin turned his gaze south. Chalkis Island was seized for its ore resources, and communications hubs were captured to track Allied deployments. But victory was not without resistance. Allied saboteurs launched a desperate infiltration of a Soviet nuclear reactor. Ordered by Nadia Zelenkov to act swiftly, the Soviet commander regained control and averted disaster. Back in Western Europe, the Soviets began assembling the Iron Curtain, a revolutionary defensive weapon. But setbacks plagued the project. An Allied raid in eastern France hijacked critical Iron Curtain components. To contain the breach, Soviet forces leveled the region, and Zelenkov executed Gradenko for his failure. With tensions rising and Stalin growing increasingly unstable, the Soviets intercepted reports of a new Allied superweapon, the chronosphere. Stalin's obsession peaked. He ordered the commander to take it, or destroy it. The first attempt to secure the device failed, but the capture of Albert Einstein gave the Soviets an opportunity. A fake execution, a bugged watch, and Allied overconfidence revealed the second chronosphere's location in Iberia. The Red Army advanced rapidly, securing 3 transmitters needed to stabilize the device, but a fourth, hidden by Kukov, caused the chronosphere to self-destruct. In a fit of rage, Stalin strangled Kukov with his bare hands. With the chronosphere lost, Stalin issued a final decree. If the superweapon could not be taken, then Europe would be buried with it. And so it was. The Allies retreated to Great Britain, their final bastion. But the Soviets would not allow even an island of resistance. Legions of mammoth tanks, Iron Curtain-enhanced infantry, and naval support crossed the Channel and unleashed annihilation. London fell in flames. British defences crumbled under overwhelming Soviet force. With Europe under his iron grip, Stalin stood triumphant, not in Moscow, but in Buckingham Palace, savouring the final act of his total conquest. Inside Buckingham Palace, now the heart of a Soviet Europe, Joseph Stalin celebrated his victory with unchecked glee. The war was over. The Allies defeated. The red banner flew from London to Moscow. Flushed with triumph, Stalin congratulated his commander and promised a personal reward. He laughed, danced, and drank the tea prepared for him by Nadia Zelenkov, his trusted aide. Moments later, he began to choke. Nadia stepped forward coldly, revealing she had poisoned the tea. As Stalin collapsed, gasping, she drew her pistol and fired 4 shots into his back, and a final round into his eye. Her loyalty to the Soviet Union had been a lie. She revealed the truth. She served the Brotherhood of Nord, a shadowy organization that had infiltrated the Soviet hierarchy and guided the war from behind the scenes. But before she could leave, Stalin's advisor Kane, silent until now, shot her in the back. He stepped forward and spoke just one line: "I am the future." In this fractured timeline, the Soviet Union was never truly sovereign. Its elite, its leaders, even its ideology, were all vessels of the Brotherhood. As Europe fell under red banners, the seeds of the Tiberium Age had already been sown. But although this timeline is intriguing, filled with betrayal, shadow wars, and the rise of Cain, it is not the one that would endure in the Red Alert timeline, although some speculate that it is the true backstory to the Tiberium War. This next chapter tells the canonical story from the Allied perspective, where the Western world, against all odds, stood firm against the Soviet onslaught. Now we turn to that timeline. The timeline that would give rise to both the Red Alert universe and likely the Tiberium universe as well. In this version of events, the Soviet Union launched its conquest of humanity much like it did in the Soviet victory path of World War II. But this war would unfold very differently. Thus began the Second World War, not with the thunder of German blitzkrieg, but with the relentless advance of Soviet tank columns and the eerie, silent drift of nerve gas across European fields. the Soviet war machine made its first moves in East Asia, the Middle East and Eastern Europe. Massive formations of Red Army divisions swept across these regions with ruthless efficiency. In the shadow of Poland's resistance, one of the darkest moments of the early war unfolded. Outside the town of Torun, a large Polish resistance cell rose against the Soviet occupation. But they were not just defeated, they were eradicated. The Red Army leveled the region, executing not just the fighters, but the surrounding civilian population. The massacre was covered up, but the stench of atrocity lingered. By this time, the USSR held sway over Finland, Hungary, Slovakia, Romania, Poland, and had secured Iraq to prepare a southern assault on Turkey. The Soviets struck a devastating blow behind enemy lines. In a daring raid, they kidnapped Albert Einstein from within Germany. The physicist, who had been developing advanced technologies for the Allies, was now in Soviet hands. Reacting swiftly, the Allies deployed elite operative Tanya Adams to the Slovakian-Hungarian border. With a small team, she stormed the Soviet outpost, exploiting its over-reliance on Tesla coils and the lack of protection for its power plants. The rescue was a success, but the daring raid highlighted how vulnerable the Allies had become. As Soviet offensives intensified, Allied forces were pushed into retreat. A gifted young commander was tasked with a critical mission: hold the Sudets mountain pass at the Polish-Czechoslovak border. With limited troops and dwindling supplies, the commander's forces held the line, buying time for an Allied convoy to escape. In an effort to maintain their fragile grip on Poland, Tanya was dispatched again, this time to destroy key bridges on the Polish-Soviet border. Her sabotage was flawless, severing Soviet supply lines, but the victory was short-lived. The Red Army regrouped, encircled the main Allied force in Poland, and crushed it. The Allied commander was forced once more into a desperate defense of the Sudets. Despite facing Soviet heavy tanks and Yak aircraft, his forces repelled the assault. A rare moment of hope, but the hope would not last. The Greek front collapsed, and Soviet flags were raised over Greece, Turkey, Iraq, Syria, and Cyprus. Simultaneously, Central Europe buckled under Soviet pressure. Germany fell, and Soviet forces penetrated eastern France, northern Italy, and the Benelux region. Yet, just as defeat seemed inevitable, Allied diplomats secured a miracle. A proposal for global military funding was brought before the United Nations. In a historic vote, the initiative passed. A global defense agency was formed, headquartered in secrecy. Reinforcements and resources would now flow to the Allies. While transporting critical intelligence on a top-secret Soviet project, Tanya Adams was captured near Grodno. Tortured and scheduled for transport to Moscow, her fate seemed sealed. General Gunther von Essling authorized a rescue mission. The Allied commander infiltrated the prison, freed Tanya, and ensured the escape. The spy who helped her died in the process, but the mission succeeded. However, Tanya returned with dire news. The Soviets were building a terrifying new weapon, the Iron Curtain, a machine that could make Soviet units almost invulnerable to damage. With Einstein's help, the Allies devised a plan to cripple Soviet Iron Curtain research. A strike team was launched from newly liberated Greek coastal regions to attack Soviet submarine bases in the Aegean, doubling as research facilities. The mission was a success, but the damage was only temporary. Soon after, Allied intelligence intercepted a report from Bornholm, Denmark, confirming the Iron Curtain development. Acting fast, Allied forces stormed Soviet radar facilities in the region, hoping to sever their coordination capabilities. Meanwhile, Allied forces struck from Asia Minor, liberating Syria and Iraq, then pushed north. Norway, Sweden, Greece and Cyprus were retaken in rapid succession. The initiative had returned to the Allies. Behind the front lines, Einstein led work on a game-changing weapon, the chronosphere, a teleportation device rooted in the theories of the Philadelphia experiment. The main facility, based in Leich, neared breakthrough when the Soviets launched an assault. On the eve of a critical experiment, the Allied commander led a brilliant defense, protecting the tech center and ensuring the project's continuation. The tide had turned. The Soviet advance had stalled. Then came a chilling revelation. Soviet researcher Vladimir Kosygin, seeking asylum, contacted von Essling and revealed the existence of Soviet atomic missiles. Extracted by a covert Allied team in Riga, Koskin warned Stalin was preparing to destroy Europe. The Allied commander was dispatched to the Dark Horseman base in the Ural Mountains, the Soviet missile development site. As Allied forces closed in, 4 nuclear missiles were launched. Acting decisively, he led a squad to infiltrate the launch facility, joined mid-mission by Tanya Adams. Together, they disabled all 4 silos, stopping the warheads just before impact. One missile, dug out from the earth near British Parliament, became a grim symbol of how close the world had come to annihilation. With Soviet forces collapsing, the Allies went on the offensive. A massive amphibious assault was launched near Stalingrad, clearing a path up the Volga River. Rumors spread of an advanced Iron Curtain prototype coming online. Allied longbows located and destroyed the facility before it could be deployed. Intelligence from captured tech centers revealed an underground weapons plant fueling the Red Army. A commando raid eliminated the threat. The final act of the war began. Tanya led a covert operation to secure funds and clear landing zones for the Allied push into Moscow. As her mission succeeded, the bulk of the Allied force arrived. A devastating battle followed. The Soviets fought to the last, but were overwhelmed. During the siege, Stalin was buried beneath rubble and later found by Allied infantry. Nikos Stavros, whose homeland had suffered under Soviet rule, ordered that Stalin be left to die. Gagged and abandoned, the dictator was left beneath the ruins of his broken empire. The war was over, but peace, as always, would prove temporary. In one fractured timeline, the Soviet Union never recovered from its defeat. Strangled by reparations and international pressure, it collapsed into disarray, giving rise to strange new wars, alien elements, and the emergence of Tiberium. That timeline continues in a different video. But in the Canon Red Alert timeline, the story took a different path. The Allies emerged victorious from the Second World War. Determined to prevent another global conflict, they set about declawing the Russian bear. The Soviet military was dismantled, its MiGs grounded, its nuclear submarines dismantled, its armies disbanded. To ensure long-term compliance, the Allies installed a puppet ruler, Premier Alexander Romanov. Romanov was an ideal choice, at least on paper. A Soviet aristocrat and member of the Communist Party, he outwardly embraced peace and diplomacy. For a time, he played his part well. Under his leadership, the USSR extended humanitarian aid, forged alliances with socialist nations, and projected an image of reform. But beneath the surface, Romanov was seething. He remembered Stalin and the humiliation the Soviet Union had endured at the hands of the West, the disarmament, the occupation, the loss of pride. And quietly, methodically, Romanov began to rebuild. Denied access to MiGs and missile subs, he turned to alternative technologies. Massive, heavily armored tanks, culminating in the monstrous Apocalypse tank, began rolling off secret production lines. Without traditional air power, Romanov turned to the skies with Kirov airships, hulking zeppelins that could devastate cities. And then there were his other assets. Yuri, a powerful psychic with unknown origins and disturbing abilities, became Romanov's most valuable secret weapon. Alongside him stood General Vladimir, a seasoned battlefield commander. Under their guidance, Romanov forged the new Soviet military into something unlike anything the world had seen before. After years of hiding its true intentions behind diplomacy and denuclearization treaties, the Soviet Union made its move. Under the guise of supporting a revolution in Mexico, Romanov deployed a vast ground army to North America. Simultaneously, Soviet fleets amassed in the Atlantic and Pacific, preparing for a global strike. The invasion began with overwhelming force. Soviet Kirov airships launched from hidden forward positions, bombing American cities on both coasts. Dreadnought missile cruisers shelled critical infrastructure along the eastern seaboard, while massive waves of paratroopers descended across urban centers, disrupting communications and defense lines. From the south, Soviet armor poured across the Texas border, catching American forces off guard. In the chaos, President Michael Duggan authorized a full nuclear counterstrike in a desperate bid to halt the invasion. But it was already too late. Yuri, Romanov's top advisor and a master of psychic warfare, had infiltrated American command systems. He broadcast a psychic signal that mind-controlled the missile silo crews. The warheads launched but detonated inside their own silos, rendering America's nuclear arsenal useless. With their greatest deterrent neutralized, US forces were left exposed. The West Coast collapsed rapidly. San Francisco fell to Soviet naval and airborne forces, and with it, the Pacific Defense Line. In the east, the Soviets raised the Statue of Liberty in a symbolic attack designed to demoralize the American people. Around this time, the timeline split yet again. We'll briefly touch upon the non-canon Soviet version of events, where the Red Army focused on subduing the Pentagon. An unnamed Soviet commander led decisive victories, the destruction of the Pentagon, the capture of New York City using a psychic beacon, and the annihilation of the US Pacific Fleet. Globally, the Soviets crush a Korean invasion, electrify the Eiffel Tower to destroy Allied forces in Paris, and dismantle Allied superweapons in the Virgin Islands and Alaska. Meanwhile, Romanov falls under the influence of Yuri. His psychic advisor, who ultimately murders him, frames General Vladimir and takes control of the war effort. Yuri's forces eliminated Vladimir and later mind-controlled the US president, bringing the American government under Soviet influence. As the Allies prepare a last-ditch assault using the chronosphere, Soviet forces cross into Alaska and destroy it, ensuring global domination. However, the final stages of the war reveal Yuri's deeper betrayal. After Romanov's deathbed warning is uncovered, the commander storms Moscow and defeats Yuri's forces in the Kremlin. Yuri is believed dead, but he isn't. In a final twist, it's revealed that Yuri has survived, preserving his consciousness as a brain in a vat, continuing to plot in secret. Sadly though, this timeline was never continued, so we will now turn to the Allied timeline. In this timeline, the Soviets did not focus on destroying the Pentagon. Instead, they turned their focus to subduing major American cities. They advanced on New York City, but the city narrowly held. A sabotage operation destroyed the Soviets' hastily built supply base, halting their offensive, at least for now. Despite local resistance, the situation grew increasingly dire. Soviet armies spread northward from Mexico, carving a path through the Great Plains toward the Mississippi. At the same time, Soviet amphibious forces landing in the northeast established beachheads and moved inland. The Soviets, led by Yuri's Psychic Corps, deployed psychic beacons in occupied cities. These devices suppressed resistance by enslaving the minds of civilians, turning entire regions into obedient extensions of Soviet control. Washington, D.C. fell to this tactic, and the US government was briefly compromised before being evacuated north into Canada. A new Allied command was established in exile, coordinating what little resistance remained. The Soviets continued pressing their advantage. They launched a major campaign toward Chicago, hoping to split the United States in two. In a bold move, American forces launched a counterattack from across the Great Lakes and retook parts of the city. There, they uncovered a powerful Soviet weapon, the Psychic Amplifier, a structure capable of broadcasting mind control signals across the entire continent. Before it could be activated, the amplifier was destroyed, but Soviet General Vladimir responded with brutal finality. He ordered a tactical nuclear strike on the city. Chicago was obliterated, along with the American Relief Army and much of the Soviet occupation force. With Chicago in ruins, the US military fractured, and a third of the nation under Soviet control, the war reached its darkest hour. The American people had been battered, mind-controlled, and bombed. Yet, they had not surrendered. The Soviet Union stood on the brink of global victory, but the final chapter of the war had yet to be written. For much of the early conflict, European nations, including the United Kingdom, France, and Germany, had refused to join the fight, fearing Soviet nuclear retaliation. However, the nuclear bombing of Chicago finally pushed them toward action. They agreed to enter the war only if the United States succeeded in eliminating 2 Soviet ICBM silos stationed near the Polish border. In one of the most critical missions of the war, Agent Tanya led a commando team across enemy lines and successfully destroyed both silos. The Soviets relocated their remaining missiles deep into Russian territory, where they were out of range of Europe and rendered strategically useless. With the nuclear threat defanged, Europe officially joined the Allies, dividing Soviet forces across two major fronts and reducing pressure on the United States. This also allowed Professor Albert Einstein, working out of his lab in the Black Forest, to collaborate more openly with Allied command. One of his most impactful contributions was the Prism Tower, developed to counter Soviet Tesla coil technology. With new technological advantages in hand, American forces launched an assault on Washington, D.C. and liberated the city. Although much of the capital had been left in ruins, the Pentagon remained intact, and the successful operation marked a major symbolic and strategic victory. Allied leadership returned to the capital, and shortly after, the Republic of Korea joined the war on the Allied side. The Soviets responded with an assault on Pearl Harbor, hoping to seize the Hawaiian Islands and regain the initiative. While they succeeded in capturing Kauai and Niihau, they failed to take Oahu and were ultimately repelled. The American defense blunted the Soviet advance across the Pacific, providing further breathing room for operations on the mainland. Still desperate to regain momentum, the Soviets launched a counterattack on St. Louis, deploying a psychic beacon to subjugate the city. However, Tanya's team once again slipped past Soviet defenses, destroyed the beacon hidden in the bombed-out Bush Memorial Stadium, and allowed Allied ground forces to retake the city. By this time, the Allies had fielded mobile Prism tanks, long-range artillery vehicles with devastating firepower that helped crush Soviet base defenses and accelerate their retreat. In a separate development, the Soviets managed to capture a Prism tower and began efforts to reverse engineer it at a secret lab hidden in the Mayan ruins of Tulum, deep in Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula. However, a team of US Navy SEALs infiltrated the facility and destroyed it, eliminating any Soviet gains from the captured technology. Meanwhile, Allied forces removed the last Soviet presence in California and reasserted control over the entire continental United States. The Soviets then turned to more desperate tactics. They deployed suicide bombers in targeted assassination missions, killing several Allied officers, including General Ben Carville, the Supreme Allied Commander. Realizing that Einstein was the architect behind many of the Allies' game-changing technologies, and that he was now working on a new chronosphere, the Soviets launched a major ground offensive from Poland into southern Germany, aiming to destroy Einstein's facility in the Black Forest. In a massive three-pronged attack, they deployed elite forces and their most advanced weapon, the Apocalypse tank. The battle that followed was long and brutal. However, the Allies, supported by Einstein's latest innovation, the Mirage tank capable of cloaking itself as a tree, were able to repel the invasion. Though the cost was high, the Soviet forces were pushed back and Einstein's lab was secured. With that, the Allies held firm. The Soviet advance had stalled and momentum had begun to shift permanently in favor of the free world. Realizing that a prolonged conventional war would result in years of bloodshed and immense losses, the Allies devised a bold plan to end the war by using Einstein's newly developed chronosphere to teleport an invasion force directly into Moscow, striking at the heart of the Soviet Union. However, the chronosphere could only be safely constructed in a location with precise magnetic conditions, a small island in the Florida Keys, just kilometers from Soviet-controlled Cuba. The Soviets recognized the threat and launched repeated attacks on the site. The Allies repelled these assaults and launched an amphibious campaign on Cuba, destroying 3 nuclear missiles before they could be launched at the chronosphere facility. With the island secured and the chronosphere activated, the Allies initiated a full-scale chrono invasion of Moscow. Armored divisions, Prism tanks, and a construction yard were teleported in. The Soviet forces, caught off guard, scrambled to defend their capital. Despite being surprised, the Soviets still retained an operational nuclear missile silo and had secretly rebuilt the Iron Curtain, giving them powerful tools for defense. Urban warfare broke out across Moscow. The Allies countered Soviet resistance with their own superweapons, deploying the weather control device and leveraging the chronosphere's teleportation to isolate and dismantle Soviet defenses. They eventually overran all Soviet military positions in the city, destroying the nuclear silo and Iron Curtain, and defeating Romanov's Black Guard. Premier Romanov, refusing to surrender, barricaded himself inside the Kremlin and continued to issue delusional threats. Agent Tanya was deployed to lead a final assault on the building. After clearing out his remaining guards, she found Romanov in a humiliating state, stripped down to his underwear. His image was broadcast around the world, symbolizing the utter collapse of the Soviet regime. Romanov was captured and taken to Great Britain, where he signed a formal treaty of surrender, ending the war. He was imprisoned in the Tower of London as the Soviet Union was dismantled and his military capacity stripped to prevent future aggression. However, amidst the celebration, the Allies overlooked a crucial threat. Yuri was missing. Unaccounted for during the chaos in Moscow, he had vanished, and with him, the real danger was only beginning. While the world celebrated its hard-won victory over the Soviet Union, a far greater threat was already emerging in the shadows. Yuri, former Soviet psychic advisor, had used the chaos of the war to quietly build his own power. Without the knowledge of either the Allies or the remnants of the Soviet regime, Yuri's psychic core constructed a network of psychic dominators across the globe. Superweapons capable of unleashing enough psychic energy to mind control the entire human population. One such device was secretly installed on Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay. When the United States discovered the installation, Yuri made his move. He contacted President Dugan directly and coldly announced his intention to take over the world, not through weapons, but through control of mind, body, and soul. Dugan offered Yuri a full pardon in exchange for peace. Yuri refused. With no time to lose, the president ordered a full airstrike on Alcatraz. The attack failed. Although one Harrier jet crashed into the island's nuclear reactor and temporarily disabled the Dominator's power core, the device remained structurally intact, and Yuri was far from defeated. As Yuri's engineers scoured San Francisco for an alternative power source, the rest of his psychic dominator network came online. Across the world, vast swaths of humanity fell under Yuri's control in an instant. Civilian populations, entire armies, and even political leaders were psychically enslaved. Global communications fell silent. Nations crumbled from within. The world stood on the brink of collapse. Only a handful of allied forces, those fortunate enough to be outside the reach of the Dominator network, remained free. For them, the war was not over. In fact, it had only just begun. Join us next time, where things spiral from wild to outright insane. We're diving headfirst into mind control, paradoxes, and even more time travel chaos, as we unravel the story of Yuri's Revenge and Red Alert 3.